Good evening, Naomi. Our children are going back to such a different environment. Most adults have been out, even if it's just to the shops. But a lot of our children have simply been at home. It'll be a very, very different world for them, won't it?
It will indeed, Sally. It is going to be a different world. I think we perhaps just need to begin by normalizing the fear and anxiety, not just of some of our kids, but of our parents and our educators as well. Because based on that normalizing, I think we can offer so much more support. So the world is going to be very different. And our role as parents is to really be able to communicate those differences calmly and honestly and age appropriately. Well, so we know.
Sorry to interrupt, but I was saying that is the real trick. It's age appropriate, so it differs depending on how old your child is. You want to explain the risks so that with enough emphasis that you get buy-in, but not overdo it so that you completely terrify your child. What are your top tips for getting that conversation right?
I actually think that one of the most important things we can do is actually reframe this. And firstly, to not see this as a new forever, but to remember that this is a new for now normal. And by reframing it, instead of we're putting these restrictions into place as a fear of the virus, to actually we're putting them into place because we are being kind and considerate to one another and we're caring for one another. If we reframe it like that, we're actually empowering our children because we all feel empowered when we can help one another. So I think so critically is how we actually face this and speak to our children about it and how we frame it. You see, the risk is that our own anxiety, our own fear, and we know children just absorb that. So we've really, as parents, got to monitor our own anxiety in how we are communicating these things to our children.
Now, obviously, we know that the plan is to start with grade 7s and 12 come Monday. That is indeed if schools actually do reopen, and we know that that is in question this evening with the 5 teacher unions calling for no schools to reopen on Monday as an act of solidarity until they're all ready. But how would you speak to a grade 7 about things like how they interact with each other? They're old enough probably to understand that if you play too closely together, you could infect each other. What sort of conversation would you have with a grade 7 and with a grade 12?
I think we actually need to take into account that we so often underestimate our children. We underestimate what they're able to understand. We also underestimate their problem-solving abilities. So to be able to communicate, they by now know so much about the virus and what is happening, but to actually elicit their skills and their problem solving in terms of social distancing and how they can get around that, how they can still communicate, still interact, still share, still do so much of what they were doing. We just have to look at this in a completely different way. I think we underestimate our children.
Fair enough. Give us some practical tips. I'm thinking things like we always teach our children to share, but we can't share our lunch now. We can't share our sweets and that sort of thing. That's potentially dangerous.
Absolutely, it is. And I think so again, by what our children are going to need is an emotionally present adult to involve them in brainstorming. Our children are naturally creative thinkers, far more, I think, than sometimes we as adults are. And by getting that group of children together and brainstorming these ideas as a class, and perhaps to use this initial period, education is not going to be able to continue where it left off from an academic perspective. We're going to have to regroup, reconnect, and use the first while to really go through some of these things with our children and with our teens, such as how do we now share? How do we show kindness? How do we show compassion? How do we show empathy? There's so many possibilities, and I think our children are going to astound us with what they come up with.
It's also very likely that if a child sneezes in class, other children will turn and point and say, oh, you've got COVID, which could actually almost be a bullying tactic. So that tolerance and kindness, as you say, is so very important. Let's talk about the masks, because I personally hate wearing mine. I find it deeply uncomfortable, especially with spectacles. You're suggesting a very practical exercise to get used to masks, trying out different ones. Tell us what we should do perhaps this weekend to get our kids used to masks.
Well, I think one first has to find out what the regulations at the different schools are, because different schools have different regulations of what they are allowing in terms of masks. But then there are so many different types. So it really is a matter of trying them, letting your child try different types and experiment with what is most comfortable. You know, just practically, some prefer around the head, some prefer just around their ears. So really to look at the different types and then encourage them to have them on for prolonged periods of time. Because as you've said, you know, for many of us adults, we can have them on for a few minutes and then we're pulling at them and we're tugging at them. So to really get our children comfortable. And again, what I find is if we explain to them why they are wearing a mask, that it's actually to protect and to look after others and those around them, they're far more willing to engage in these kind of restrictions. So it is so important how we're framing these things for them.
What do you do with the anxious child who is afraid to go back to school? Because we know that children mostly get COVID-19 in a very mild form, but there are cases where children have been adversely affected. So what is your message to have that conversation to calm an anxious child?
I think, again, very important is how we as parents are putting these things apart. You know, things even like how we are talking about this in front of our children. We've got to be so aware of that, especially if we have an anxious child. Anxious children thrive when they know what the boundaries are, when they know what is being placed in order to keep them safe, in order for their protection. So that's when we see them really being okay. But there is going to be a time, depending on how anxious children are, where we might see things like separation anxiety. We might see anxiety skyrocket. We're going to have to take these things one step at a time. But really for parents to be able to, again, talk unemotionally, age appropriately, lay down the facts for their children. And what is also going to make such a difference is to have educators that are emotionally in tune. And I really suggest that every morning, the first thing that needs to happen is just a classroom chat with an educator who can be present, who can really listen to all the fears. You know, by creating a space where our children feel that we are just listening to them and hearing their anxiety, it makes such a difference if they know that we as adults understand them and are putting everything in place to look after them.
Thank you very much. Some lovely suggestions there. That's Naomi Holt, educational psychologist, giving us some tips on how we as parents can prepare our children for going back to school.